A very famous mythology in Israel is that Palestine was a land without people, waiting for people without land. And it took a while for me and others to try and convince the Israeli academic community. It was much easier to convince the more global academic community that Palestine was not an empty land when the first Zionist settler arrived there in the late 19th century. When they arrived in Palestine, the Palestinians were already enjoying a thriving cultural, social, and economic life. They were not yet defined as Palestinians, that is true. Nobody was defined in national terms in the late 19th century. There were, it is also true, citizens or inhabitants of the subjects of the Ottoman Empire, but nonetheless they already had their own characteristic as a nation, and had Zionism not arrived in Palestine, they would have become just another Arab national movement like the Syrians.
Tell us a bit about Theodor Herzl, that was, or is known as one of the founders of Zionism, who was not religious at all, right? And I think he didn't speak Yiddish or anything.
That's right. Zionism had one element that is usually forgotten by historians, and this was a wish to secularize Jewish life. And if you secularize the Jewish religion, you cannot use later the Bible as a justification for occupying Palestine. So it was a bizarre mixture, which I like always to call that it's a movement made by people who do not believe in God, but God nonetheless promised them Palestine. And I think that is something that is at the heart of the internal problems of Israeli Jewish society today. But I think it's also important to understand that even before Herzl, there were people who thought about themselves as Zionists, but were aware of the existence of Palestinians in Palestine, and were thinking of different kinds of connection to Palestine and solutions for the insecurity of Jews in Europe, like Hada'am, who said that maybe Palestine would be just a spiritual center, and Jews, if they feel insecure in Europe, should settle elsewhere outside of Europe or settle in more secure European societies. One important group of people that did not allow them in a way to do this were Christian Zionists that already existed in those days, who believed that the return of the Jews to Palestine was part of a divine scheme, and they wanted the Jews to return to Palestine because it could precipitate the second coming of the Messiah. I think they were also anti-Semites. It was like a double bill. They could also get rid of the Jews of Europe at the same time. So I think it's an important period to go back to understand how British imperialism, Christian Zionism, and of course Jewish nationalism played together as a formidable force that left very few chances for the Palestinians when it erupted eventually as facts on the ground in the late 19th century.
I guess you have to add to this anti-Semitism as well, right? That's what you said.
Yeah.
When you hear Lord Balfour and the sort of the politicians at the time, they wanted the Jews to live in Palestine because they didn't want the Jews to live in England or anywhere else in Europe, and so. Yeah, history is crucial, and we've talked a few hours ago about knowledge and the way knowledge is transmitted. And so can you tell us about this, about how history and how knowledge, if it's properly taught, can enlighten people?
Yes, definitely. I think that we've already pointed out to it that if you don't have an historical perspective, and if you don't know the facts, and you don't have an historical understanding, you accept the kind of negative depictions that the world and the Israelis have on the Palestinians. We gave one example of what is so-called Palestinian terrorism, that in the Israeli perspective and in some Western perspective comes out of the blue. We don't know why these people are violent. Maybe it's because they're Muslims, maybe it's their political culture. And it's only when you have an historical understanding, you say, wait a minute, I understand where this violence comes from. I understand the source of the violence. And then you come and say, actually settling in my house by force is an act of violence. Maybe I was wrong, maybe I was right to try and resist it by violence, but it begins by the very invasion of my space and the place where I live. And when this invasion is accompanied by a wish to get rid of me, what else can I do? So I think that this historical dimension is important first for a better understanding for why the conflict continues. The second reason is that we will never succeed in changing political views about the Palestine issue if we won't explain to people how knowledge was manipulated. And I think one of the major challenges is to find space for Israelis and Western people to be able to understand how it all began, in the sense that even the first Zionist settlers, when they came and realized that what they thought was an empty land, or at least their own land, was full of other people, they regarded these people as aliens, as violent aliens, who took over the land. And it is this infrastructure that they have built about the other side that feeds all the Israeli perceptions and visions. It's a dehumanization of the Palestinians that begins in the late 19th century. And how to explain to people that they're actually a product of these alienations and these kind of defamation, if you want even, of the Palestinians is one of the biggest tasks for anyone who is engages in alternative education or trying to convey a different message to the Israeli Jewish society.
And I guess that's what your job has been about, going back into history, studying the facts and the archives. And so going back in history, people, I mean, I guess the educated on the subject people think the conflict started in 1948 and with pretty much, the Holocaust. Some people will say the conflict started in 1967. But I'd like you to, because I know you've studied this a lot, to talk about what actually historically was the first Palestinian Intifada of the late 30s, 1936, and the revolt against mostly UK imperialism and also Zionist huge immigration.
Yeah, I think it's important to go back to even earlier than 1936 in order to understand 1936. You have to go back to the late 19th century when Zionism appeared as a movement that had two noble objectives, if you want. One was to find a safe place for Jews who felt insecure in a growing atmosphere of anti-Semitism, and also, and this was also noble and acceptable, that some Jews wanted to redefine themselves as a national group, not just as a religion. The problem started when they chose Palestine as a territory in which to implement these two impulses. And it was clear that because the land was inhabited, that you would have to do it by force. And you had to, in a way, contemplate the depopulation of the inhabitants, of the indigenous people. And it takes time for the Palestinian community to realize that this is the plan. And even the Balfour Declaration did not steer, when it was adopted in November 1917, did not steer yet the public in Palestine to revolt against the British policy or the Zionist strategy. But by 1936, you can already see the beginning of the real results of this strategy. Palestinians are evicted from land purchased by the Zionist movement. Palestinians lose jobs because of a Zionist strategy to take over the labor market. And it was very clear that Europe is going to, or the Jewish problem of Europe is going to be solved in Palestine. And
by 1933, protests against Jewish immigration were becoming ever more frequent in Palestine. Women took part side by side with men. The British authorities cracked down on demonstrations and arrested thousands. Many were killed and wounded. Musa Kazim al-Husseini, the 80-year-old former mayor of Jerusalem, was beaten by British soldiers during a demonstration in Jaffa. He later died of his injuries. The British authorities became ever more heavy-handed.
رغبة بريطانيا بمنح المطالب الوطنية للشعب الفلسطيني وعدم رؤيتها للشعب الفلسطيني كمجموعة قومية وطنية ذات حقوق ومعاملتها على أساس إنها طوائف أدى في حين عاملت الوكالة اليهودية على أساس أنها ممثلة لمجموعة قومية. كل هذا مجتمعا أدى إلى تفاقم الوضع والصدام مع بريطانيا.
In the 1930s, the number of Jews immigrating to Palestine began to increase significantly. From 4,000 in 1931, the figure jumped to 9,500 the following year. In 1933, the number rose to 30,000. In 1934, 42,000. And in 1935, a further jump to 62,000. That same year, Palestinian poet Abdul Rahim Mahmoud wrote a poem which he read aloud to Prince Saud bin Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia, who was visiting Jerusalem. He asked, "Did you come to visit the Holy Aqsa Mosque, or to bid it farewell before it is lost?" A Palestinian film archive had once existed, but had since been lost or gone mysteriously missing. Eventually, in the vaults of the British Library, we found glimpses of this bygone era.
Towards the unexpected, vast immigration of Jews from Europe into their homeland. Palestinians, like most Arabs, are very hospitable people. And the initial reaction in the 1920s to the mass immigration of Jews, most of them very poor Jews, was to welcome them as poor people, allow them to be part of the society. What they did not accept was when it became clear, more or less in the late 1920s, that these settlers don't want to be guests. They want to be the owners of the house. And not just the owner of the house, they want to be the exclusive owners of the house. So yes, Palestinian resistance started there and then, but it was a very legitimate resistance against colonization of their own homeland. Factors pushed the Palestinians for the first time to say, we have to do something about it. And they tried to revolt. And you needed the whole might of the British Empire to crash that revolt, as indeed happened. It took them 3 years, and they used a repertoire of actions against the Palestinians that were as bad as those that would be used later on by the Israelis to quell the the Palestinian Intifada of 1987 and that of 2000.
And this revolt of 36 was a very popular revolt, right? It was the Fallah, right? The peasants also that took arms, and also I think reading your books and I've realized that the squashing and the way this revolt was so violently squashed in a way helped in 48. The Palestinian was that weak in 48 because all the leaders and all the potential fighting elements had been killed or had to go into exile in 36.
Absolutely. The Palestinian political elite lived in the cities of Palestine, but the main victims of Zionism up to the 1930s were in the countryside. And that's why the revolt started in the countryside. But there were sections of the urban elite that joined them. And yes, indeed, I pointed out in one of my books that the British have killed or imprisoned most of those who belong to the Palestinian political elite and military, or potentially military elite. So actually they created a Palestinian society that was quite defenseless in 1947 when the first Zionist actions, with the knowledge that the British mandate came to an end, had commenced. And I think it had an impact on the inability of the Palestinians to resist a year later, in 1948, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Today. But I think it's also important to understand that even before Herzl, there were people who thought about themselves as Zionists, but were aware of the existence of Palestinians in Palestine, and were thinking of different kinds of connection to Palestine and solutions for the insecurity of Jews in Europe, like Hada'am, who said that maybe Palestine would be just a spiritual center of Jewish life. And if you secularize the Jewish religion, you cannot use later the Bible as a justification for occupying Palestine. So it was a bizarre mixture, which I like always to call that it's a movement made by people who do not believe in God, but God nonetheless promised them Palestine. And I think that is something that is at the heart of the internal problems of Israeli Jewish society in the late 19th century. When they arrived in Palestine, the Palestinians were already enjoying a thriving cultural, social, and economic life. They were not yet defined as Palestinians, that is true. Nobody was defined in national terms in the late 19th century. There were, it is also true, citizens or inhabitants of the subjects of the Ottoman Empire, but nonetheless they already had their own characteristic as a nation, and had Zionism not arrived in Palestine, they would have become just another Arab national movement like the Syrians.
Tell us a bit about Theodor Herzl, that was, is known as one of the founders of Zionism, who was not religious at all, right? And I think he didn't speak Yiddish or anything.
That's right. Zionism had one element that is usually forgotten by historians, and this was a wish to secularize Judaism. A very famous mythology in Israel is that Palestine was a land without people, waiting for people without land. And it took a while for me and others to try and convince the Israeli academic community. It was much easier to convince the more global academic community that Palestine was not an empty land when the first Zionist settler arrived there.